The clock on the wall of the redemption bank ticked with the slow, punishing rhythm of a funeral drum. Each click was another drop of sweat tracing a path through the grime on Cale's brow. Outside, the Arizona sun baked the dust-choked street into a sheet of hammered brass, the light so fierce it bleached the color from the world. Kyle was here for a mundane transaction, an act so normal it felt like a costume he was wearing. He was withdrawing the last of his savings to buy a small patch of land, a place where the only shots fired would be at rabbits for his stew pot, a place to bury the man he used to be. He stood behind a young woman, Ilara, whose back was ramrod straight. She was with her father, the bank president, a man whose tailored suit seemed to repel the dust and heat that clung to everyone else. Kyle watched them, a detached observer. He had learned the art of invisibility, of blending into the background, until he was just another shadow on the wall. It was the only peace he had known in 5 years. The peace shattered like glass. The batwing doors flew open with a violent crash, slamming against the interior walls. 3 men spilled into the room, and their faces hidden by grimy bandanas, their movements sharp and predatory. Dust motes, violently disturbed, danced in the shafts of sunlight. The lead figure, a man who moved with a chilling theatrical grace, stepped forward. He wasn't as large as his companions, but an aura of absolute authority rolled off him in waves. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice deceptively calm, articulate. It was a voice that didn't belong to a common road agent. He swept a Colt peacemaker in a slow, deliberate arc. "This is a redistribution of wealth. Please consider it a tax on your prosperity. Your cooperation will be rewarded with your continued existence." Panic, slick and oily, coated the air. A woman whimpered. The bank teller's hands shot into the air, trembling. Kyle didn't move. His body went preternaturally still, his senses screaming. He cataloged the threats: 3 men, 2 near the door, 1 in the center, all holding pistols. He noted their stances, the way they held their weapons, for the lazy confidence that spoke of experience. His own gun, a Schofield revolver he hadn't fired in 5 years, was a cold, heavy weight, tucked into his waistband, hidden beneath his worn duster. A ghost. The leader, whose eyes glinted with a cruel intelligence above his bandana, sauntered toward the counter. "Mr. Thompson," he said, addressing Ilara's father by name. "A pleasure to finally make your acquaintance. The vault, if you would be so kind." Thompson, his face the color of spoiled milk, fumbled with his keys. As the heavy vault door swung open, the leader's gaze drifted to Ilara. She stood frozen, a deer caught in the glare of a lantern, her hands clenched at her throat. His eyes narrowed on the glint of silver against her skin. "What a lovely little trinket," he murmured, stepping toward her. He reached out, his gloved fingers brushing her neck. Ilara flinched, a small gasp escaping her lips. With a delicate tug, he snapped the chain and held up the prize, a small silver locket, tarnished with age and intricately carved with the image of a desert primrose. The world stopped for Cale. Air fled his lungs. The ticking clock, the muffled sobs, the scrape of gold bars being thrown into canvas bags, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. All he could see was that locket. He knew its every line, every imperfection. He knew the satisfying click of its clasp, the worn smoothness of its surface. He had given it to his wife Mary on their first anniversary a lifetime ago. It was the only thing of hers he had left in this world, a sacred relic he had entrusted to the Thompson family for safekeeping after her death, unable to bear the sight of it himself. The outlaw leader Silas Kane, though Cale did not yet know his name, dangled the locket from his fingers. He held it up to the light, a connoisseur appreciating a fine jewel. Symbols are so very important, don't you think? He mused, his voice carrying through the silent room. They tell us who we are, what we've lost. That was it. The vow of peace Cale had made on Mary's grave, the quiet life he had so desperately clawed for, turned to ash in his mouth. This wasn't a robbery anymore. It was a desecration, an invasion of his soul. The ghost in his duster stirred its fingers, itching for the cold steel of the Schofield. Silas pocketed the locket. He turned his attention back to his men who were finishing their work. "Time to depart," he announced. To ensure a clean getaway, he grabbed Alara by the arm, pulling her in front of him as a human shield. She cried out, her eyes wide with terror. "No, please." Cale saw it all in a fractured, hyper-aware reality. He saw the way Silas's knuckles whitened as he gripped Alara's arm. He saw the brutish leer on the face of the henchman by the door. He saw the path his bullet would have to travel. He saw the face of his wife, her smile, the light in her eyes, as he had first placed that locket around her neck. He had renounced violence. He had sworn never to kill again. But in that moment, he understood a terrible truth. Some vows were made to be broken. The world exploded back into motion. It wasn't a thought, but an instinct, a muscle memory buried under 5 years of regret. Cale's hand moved a blur of motion. The Schofield was in his grip and the hammer already thumbed back. There was no declaration, no warning shout. Just action. The first shot was a deafening crack that seemed to split the very air. The henchman nearest the door, or the one with the leer, crumpled without a sound, a neat dark hole appearing in his chest. The second shot followed the first so closely, they were almost one. The other guard at the door, turning in surprise, caught the bullet in his shoulder, the impact spinning him into the wall. He screamed, dropping his pistol. Silas Kane reacted with astonishing speed, shoving Alara to the floor and raising his own weapon. But Cale was already moving, diving behind a thick oak desk. Wood splintered above his head as Silas's gun roared. The quiet man in the corner was gone. In his place was U.S. Marshal Kalen Reed, a man they used to say was death's own shadow. He rose from behind the desk, his eyes cold and empty as a winter sky. He and Silas were locked in a deadly tableau, two predators suddenly aware of each other. For a heartbeat, their eyes met over the smoking barrels of their guns. In Silas's gaze, Kyle saw not shock, but a flash of something else. Recognition, and a cold, terrifying satisfaction. It was as if all of this was exactly what he had wanted. Then he was gone, vanishing through the swinging doors into the blinding Arizona sun, taking the locket and a piece of Cale's soul with him. Kyle stood breathing heavily in the sudden ringing silence, the smell of gunpowder thick in his throat. Alara was on the floor, shaken but unharmed. Her father was cowering behind the counter. One man was dead, another groaning in a pool of his own blood. He had broken his vow. The ghost was free. And Cale knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he would have to hunt Silas Kane to the very ends of the earth to get that locket back. It wasn't about the silver anymore. It was about reclaiming the last piece of a life that had been stolen from him. The dust had barely settled when Sheriff Brody arrived. He was a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the surrounding mesas, with a face like a sun-dried apple and a drooping mustache that had seen better decades. He stomped into the bank, his old spurs jingling a weary tune, and took in the scene with a single, sweeping gaze, the body, the blood, the splintered wood, and Cale, standing like a statue of judgment, his Schofield still smoking in his hand. Cale Brody sighed the name a puff of tired air. "I had a feeling your peace and quiet wasn't gonna last." "Who was it?" Leader was smart, talked like a professor. The other two were just hired muscle. Kyle said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, unused to this kind of talk. He holstered his weapon, the motion fluid and familiar. It felt wrong, like putting on a dead man's clothes. The wounded outlaw clutching his shoulder was being tended to by the town doctor, a man whose clean shirt and precise movements seemed out of place in the chaos. Alara, wrapped in a blanket someone had produced, was giving a shaky statement to one of Brody's deputies. Her eyes kept darting toward Cale, a mixture of fear and awe in them. Silas Kane, the wounded man, wheezed from the floor when Brody pressed a boot to his wound. His name's Silas Kane. Cale's head snapped up. The name meant nothing to him, yet it landed with the weight of a thrown stone. Brody grunted. Kane. Never heard of him. But he knew Thompson's name. This wasn't random. The sheriff looked at Cale, his eyes shrewd. You moved like you were born with that iron in your hand. Like you never put it down at all. I did what I had to do, Cale said, the words clipped. He couldn't explain. Later, after the body had been removed and the bank was shuttered, Brody found Cale at the town's solitary saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. The place smelled of stale beer and regret. He took something Brody said, not a question. He sat down opposite Cale, waving away the bartender. This wasn't just you stopping a robbery. I know you, Cale. You've spent 5 years avoiding so much as a harsh word. Today you put a man in the ground before he could blink. What did Kane take? Cale stared into the amber liquid in his glass. A locket. It belonged to my wife. Brody's expression softened. He knew about Mary. Everyone in Redemption knew the story of the decorated marshal who had quit the service and come west to bury his wife and then himself after she was taken by mountain fever. I'm sorry, son. He knew Cale said, his voice barely a whisper. When he looked at me, he knew who I was. This was for me. That don't make a lick of sense, the sheriff countered. Why stage a bank robbery just to get at you? That's what I'm going to find out. Cale finally downed the whiskey, the burn, a welcome distraction. He stood up, his decision made. The patch of land, the quiet life, it was all a dream from another world. I'm going after him. Alone. You're not a marshal anymore, Cale. You've got no badge, no authority. I have a reason, Kyle replied, and the finality in his tone left no room for argument. His first stop was the telegraph office. He sent a wire to the U.S. Marshals Service in Prescott, a place he hadn't contacted in 5 years. Inquiring on Silas Kane. Wanted for bank robbery murder in Redemption. Former associates, known territories, any information. Urgent. K. Reed. He didn't sign it with his old title. He wasn't that man anymore. He was just K. Reed, a man with a debt to collect. As he was leaving, a figure stepped out of the long shadows of the late afternoon. It was Alara. Her composure had returned, but her eyes were still shadowed with the day's horror. Mr. Reed, she began, her voice steady. I wanted to thank you. You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same, he lied. No, she said, shaking her head. They wouldn't have. I saw your face when he took the locket. My father told me it was your wife's. Her voice caught. I am so sorry. He should never have had it. Cale just nodded, uncomfortable with the sympathy. You're going after him, aren't you? She asked, her gaze direct and intelligent. She wasn't just the banker's daughter. There was a core of steel in her. I am. Then I'm coming with you. Cale stopped. He turned to face her fully, his expression incredulous. Absolutely not. This isn't a Sunday ride. It's dangerous. That locket was in my care, she insisted, her chin lifting. My family had a responsibility to you, and we failed. This is a matter of honor. Besides, she added, a shrewd light entering her eyes, Silas Kane knew my father's name. He robbed our bank. This involves my family as much as it involves you. I might be able to help. You'll only be in the way. His words were harsh, meant to dissuade her. I can ride as well as any man, and I can shoot, she countered, unflinching. I won't be a burden. I need to see this through. For your wife's memory, and for my own peace of mind. Cale looked at her, at the fierce determination burning in her eyes, and saw an echo of the same fire that was driving him. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to pushing people away. But the look on her face told him she would follow him whether he agreed or not. Arguing was a waste of breath he would need on the trail. Get a horse and a rifle, he said gruffly, turning away. We leave at dawn. The trail was cold, but Silas Kane's arrogance had left a clear path. He and his remaining man weren't trying to hide their horses' tracks, heading straight north into the jagged, sun-blasted territory of the Mogollon Rim. They rode for 2 days, the silence between Cale and Alara broken only by the plodding of hooves and the sigh of the wind through desolate canyons. The scorched crimson earth shimmered under a white-hot sun, and the landscape was a brutal canvas of rock and thorn. Cale was a relentless tracker, his senses honed by years of hunting men. He read the story in the disturbed stones and crushed scrub brush. 2 riders, 1 horse favoring its right foreleg. They were moving fast, but not panicked. Alara, to his surprise, kept pace without complaint. She was tough and resilient, her initial fear hardening into a quiet resolve. She asked questions not about his past, but about the hunt. How do you know they pass this way, she'd ask, and he'd point to a single, overturned rock, the underside still dark with moisture. They're making for the high country, he said, on the evening of the 2nd day, staring at the distant pine-dusted mountains. More cover, more water, harder to track. That night, they made a cold camp in the lee of a rock formation that looked like a skeletal hand clawing at the star-dusted sky. As Cale cleaned his revolver by the low fire, Alara spoke into the darkness. Why did you give it to my father? She asked softly. The locket. Cale's hands stilled. He had never spoken of this to anyone. After Mary died. I couldn't look at it. It was like holding a burning coal, but I couldn't part with it. Your father was a friend. He offered to keep it in his vault, a safe place. I thought one day, maybe I'd be ready to have it back. He snapped the cylinder back into his Schofield. The click was unnaturally loud in the vast silence. I was wrong. You loved her very much. Alara stated, her voice full of a gentle empathy that made his chest ache. She was everything, he admitted, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. She made me believe I could be more than just a man with a gun. He looked up at the indifferent stars. She believed I could find my own redemption. The next day they found the horse with the lame leg. It had been shot and left behind. A cruel but practical act. They were getting closer. That afternoon they crested a ridge and saw a thin plume of smoke rising from a box canyon a few miles ahead. Cale dismounted immediately, pulling Alara down with him. They've made camp, he whispered. His eyes narrowed. He pulled a spyglass from his saddlebag. He focused it on the camp, the brass catching a sliver of sunlight. He could see one man tending the fire. Silas Kane was nowhere in sight. It could be a trap, Alara whispered back, her hand resting on the stock of her Winchester. It is, Cale agreed. He's expecting to be followed, but he's not expecting us this soon. They tethered the horses and proceeded on foot, moving with a hunter's stealth through the rocks and scrub. The eerie silence of the canyon was broken only by the cry of a lone hawk circling high above. As they drew closer, Cale could hear the man at the fire, humming a tuneless melody. Cale motioned for Alara to stay put to cover him. He circled around using the terrain to his advantage until he was positioned on a rocky outcrop directly above the camp. The man was still there poking at the fire. But where was Silas? Suddenly, a voice dripping with amused contempt echoed from the rocks to his left. An impressive approach, Marshal. Truly, you haven't lost your touch. Cale froze, spinning toward the voice. Silas Kane stepped out from behind a towering boulder, his pistol aimed not at Cale, but at the spot where he had left Alara. But you've gained a weakness. Silas continued, a cold smile playing on his lips. His bandana was down, revealing a handsome, sharp-featured face, but his eyes were as cold and dead as a frozen lake. Drop the gun, Marshal, or the lady pays the price for your tardiness. From her hiding place, Alara let out a small, sharp gasp. The man at the fire scrambled to his feet, grabbing a rifle. Kyle was caught. He slowly, reluctantly placed his Schofield on the ground and raised his hands. I'm not a marshal anymore, Cale said, his voice a low growl. Oh, you will always be a marshal to me. Silas said, his smile widening. He gestured with his gun. Come down. Join the party. We have so much to discuss. As Cale descended into the camp, his mind raced, searching for an opening, an advantage. There was none. Silas's man kept a rifle trained on Alara, who had been forced into the open. The locket, Cale demanded. Give it back. Silas chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. He reached into his coat and produced the silver primrose, letting it swing from its broken chain. It is lovely, but it is merely a key, Marshal. A key to unlock a door you have kept bolted for a very long time. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into Cale's. Tell me, do you ever think about the Gila River, about a small farmstead about 10 miles south of the crossing, a family by the name of Miller? Cale's blood ran cold. The name, the place. It was a memory he had buried under years of whiskey and regret. A botched raid. He and his posse had been tracking the notorious Walton gang. Their intelligence said the gang was holed up at a remote farm. They had descended at dusk, guns blazing. But the intelligence was wrong. There was no gang. Just a farmer, his wife, and their young son caught in a terrible, tragic crossfire. Collateral damage, the official report had called it. There was a fire, Silas whispered, his voice laced with venom. You see, Marshal? My name isn't Kane. It's Silas Miller. That was my brother's farm, my sister-in-law, my nephew. He held up a tarnished silver pocket watch. This was my brother's. The only thing that wasn't consumed by the flames your posse started. The world tilted on its axis. The bank robbery, the locket, the taunts, it was all a meticulously crafted trap. This wasn't about money. It was about revenge. A ghost from Cale's past had risen to claim its due. It was a mistake, Cale rasped, the words tasting like ash. We thought they were outlaws. A mistake, Silas spat the word. You call the slaughter of an innocent family a mistake. You filed a report, cleared your name, and rode on. I was left to bury what was left of them. His face was a mask of pure hatred. I have spent 5 years planning this, studying you. I learned of your quiet life in redemption. I learned of your dead wife. And I learned about the locket she treasured left in the care of the town's esteemed banker. He gestured around the canyon. I didn't rob that bank for money, Marshal. I robbed it to get your attention, to take from you the last thing you hold sacred, and to bring you here to this place where you will finally pay for what you did. Alara stared horrified, the pieces clicking into place. This was a vendetta deep and personal. What do you want, Silas? Cale asked, his mind reeling. What do I want? Silas's laugh was brittle. I want you to suffer as I have suffered. I want to strip away everything you have just as you stripped away everything I had. But first, an apology. He gestured with his gun toward Cale's knees. On your knees, Marshal. You will beg for forgiveness for the family you destroyed. Cale's jaw tightened. He would not beg. Not for his life. Seeing his defiance, Silas's expression hardened. He turned his pistol and fired. Not at Cale, but at the rocks just above Alara's head. Stone chips rained down on her as she screamed. The next one won't miss, Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. Kneel. With Alara's life on the line, Kyle had no choice. The shame and fury warred within him, a bitter tide. Slowly, stiffly, he dropped to his knees in the dust. The man he used to be the symbol of justice was kneeling before the specter of his greatest failure. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on Kyle's shoulders. The dust of the canyon floor felt coarse against his knees. He was a monument to his own past sins, exposed under the harsh, unforgiving sun. That's better, Silas purred, savoring the moment. He walked a slow circle around Cale like a wolf inspecting its trapped prey. Now, say their names. Say you're sorry for murdering Sarah and Thomas Miller. Cale's throat was tight. The names echoed in the deepest, darkest chambers of his memory. He remembered the official report, the names listed under civilian casualties. He had forced himself to forget the faces. I am sorry. For what happened to your family, he ground out each word, a shard of glass. Not good enough, Silas roared, his composure cracking for the first time. He lashed out with his boot, catching Cale hard in the ribs. Cale grunted, doubling over, but refusing to fall. I want you to feel it. I want you to know what it is to have your whole world burned down because of one man's blind, self-righteous justice. Alara watched, her face pale with terror and a dawning complex understanding. This was not the simple villainy of a bank robber. This was the righteous fury of a wronged man twisted into a monstrous shape. Silas, this won't bring them back, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Silas whirled on her, his eyes blazing. Silence. You know nothing of this. Your father, the good Mr. Thompson, he certainly benefited, didn't he? A prime piece of riverfront land, suddenly available for pennies on the dollar after its owners met such a tragic end. Alara flinched as if struck. What are you talking about? Oh, did he not tell you, Silas mocked. Your family's prosperity is built in part on the ashes of mine. He was a vulture picking at the bones. Before Alara could process this sickening accusation, the world devolved into chaos. Using Silas's momentary distraction, Cale exploded upward from his knees. He drove his shoulder into Silas's midsection, a raw, powerful move that sent them both tumbling into the dirt. Silas's pistol flew from his grasp, skittering across the rocks. The henchman reacted instantly, swinging his rifle toward the fray. But Alara, galvanized by a surge of adrenaline, moved as well. She kicked out her boot, connecting solidly with the man's knee. He howled in pain, his leg buckling, and his rifle shot went wide, thudding harmlessly into the canyon wall. Cale and Silas grappled in the dust, a desperate struggle of grunts and strained muscles. Cale was stronger, but Silas was fueled by 5 years of pure distilled hatred, his wiry frame coiling with surprising strength. He drove a thumb toward Cale's eye. Cale jerked his head back, landing a hard right cross to Silas's jaw. The henchman, recovering, raised his rifle again, this time taking careful aim at Cale's back. Cale, look out, Alara screamed. She didn't hesitate. She launched herself at the gunman, grabbing the rifle barrel with both hands. He tried to shake her off, But she held on with ferocious tenacity, her actions driven by a desperate need to atone for sins she was only just beginning to understand. Cale landed another punch, dazing Silas. He scrambled for Silas's discarded pistol, his fingers closing around the grip, just as Silas recovered, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from his boot. He lunged. The shot was deafening in the confined space of the canyon. Silas froze, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his shirt, then back up at Cale. He hadn't fired. Standing a few yards away, the henchman's rifle in her hands, was Alara. Her face was a mask of shock, the barrel still smoking. She had fired not to kill, but to stop. The bullet had struck the henchman, who now lay groaning on the ground. His fight ended. In the chaotic struggle, the rifle had discharged. The standoff was over. Silas, clutching his side where a stray piece of rock shrapnel from the ricochet had struck him, was disarmed. His remaining man was wounded. Cale stood over him, Silas's own pistol now aimed squarely at his chest. "It's over," Silas Cale said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Silas looked up, not with fear, but with a strange, hollow emptiness. "No," he whispered. "Not yet. It doesn't end here." With a sudden, desperate burst of energy, he lunged not at Cale, but toward the fire. He grabbed a lit branch and hurled it toward a cluster of dry bushes near a fissure in the canyon wall. The brush went up with a whoosh, flames climbing hungrily. Behind the fire, tucked into the fissure, Cale saw it, a wooden crate stenciled with the word dynamite. "If I can't have my justice." Silas hissed, a wild, triumphant light in his eyes. "Then we will all meet our end in the fire you started." He scrambled away, disappearing into a narrow opening in the rock face, an escape route he had clearly prepared. The fire was spreading fast, moving toward the dynamite. The heat was already intense. "The horses," Cale yelled, grabbing Alara's arm. They dragged the wounded henchman away from the growing blaze and ran for the canyon mouth, the sound of the crackling fire roaring in their ears. They had barely cleared the entrance when a thunderous explosion ripped through the air, shaking the very ground beneath their feet. A plume of black smoke and debris billowed into the sky. They had escaped, but Silas Miller was gone, vanished into the mountains. And Cale knew this was only the beginning of the end. He had the pocket watch which Silas had dropped in the struggle. But Silas still had the locket. The score was far from settled. They rode back to Redemption with their prisoner, a sullen, defeated man who offered no resistance. The journey was grim. The revelations in the canyon had poisoned the air, creating a chasm of unspoken truths between Cale and Alara. She now looked at him, not as a hero but as a man with blood on his hands. And she was grappling with a horrifying possibility that her own family's comfort was rooted in that same tragedy. When they returned, Alara went straight to her father's study in the large house behind the bank. Cale waited outside, giving her the privacy she needed. He could hear raised voices, then a long, heavy silence. When she emerged, her face was pale, but resolute. In her hands, she clutched a heavy leather-bound ledger. "It's true," she said, her voice hollow. She met Cale's gaze, and for the first time, he saw not a girl, but a woman forged in a terrible crucible. "My father's ledgers. He bought the Miller property from the county for almost nothing. He called it an unfortunate but sound business opportunity." She clutched the book to her chest as if it were a shield. "This whole town, my whole life. It's been a lie." Meanwhile, Cale took the pocket watch to the sheriff's office. He and Brody examined it. Inside the cover was a faded tintype photograph of a smiling young woman and a small boy, Sarah and Thomas Miller. Cale stared at the image, and the faceless casualties from his report gained a soul. The guilt was a physical thing, a sickness in his gut. A telegraph message was waiting for him. It was the reply from Prescott. Re Silas Kane. No record. However, query on Miller family Gila River yields one survivor. Silas Miller, educated schoolteacher from back east. Believed to be unstable after family tragedy. Last known location was Silver Strike Mining District. Use extreme caution. Marshal's Service. Silver Strike Brody mused, tapping a map on his wall. That's old played-out territory. Abandoned silver mine up in the Ponderosa forests. Tunnels go for miles. A man could disappear in there forever. Kyle knew instantly. It was the perfect place for a final confrontation. A tomb. I'm going, Cale said. I'm going with you, Alara said, appearing in the doorway, the ledger still in her hands. No, Kyle said firmly. You've done enough. This is my fight. You're wrong, she replied, her voice ringing with newfound strength. This is our fight now. My father was complicit. My family has a debt to pay. I'm not just following you anymore, Cale. I am going to face him with you. I will not hide from the truth. Kyle looked at her, at the unshakable resolve in her eyes, knew there was no refusing her. They were bound together by this tragedy, two souls seeking their own form of atonement. The ride to the Silver Strike mine was tense. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. They climbed from the desert into the high country, the air growing cooler, fragrant with the scent of pine and damp earth. By the time they reached the skeletal headframe of the abandoned mine, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains. The entrance to the mine was a gaping dark maw. A cold draft smelling of wet rock and decay breathed out of it. He's in there, Cale said. He's waiting. They lit a lantern and entered the oppressive darkness, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The main tunnel was shored up with rotting timbers, water dripping from the ceiling, creating slick, muddy pools on the floor. The air was thick and close. As they ventured deeper, the distant thunder from the storm outside sounded like the groaning of the mountain itself. They found him in a large central chamber, the lantern light glinting off a web of intersecting minecart tracks. He was sitting on an overturned ore cart, the silver locket resting in his open palm. He didn't look surprised to see them. He looked weary, like an actor at the end of a long and draining play. I knew you would come, Marshal Silas said, his voice quiet. A man like you can never leave a thing unfinished. This ends tonight, Silas Cale said, his revolver steady in his hand. It does, Silas agreed. He looked at Alara, his eyes softening with something that might have been pity. And you brought the scavenger's daughter. Did you come to see your inheritance firsthand? These tunnels run right under the land your father stole. I came to make things right, Alara said, her voice not breaking. She held up the ledger. This is the proof of what he did, of what you lost. When this is over, I will see to it that your family's name is cleared and the land is returned. A flicker of emotion crossed Silas's face, pain, surprise, but it was gone as quickly as it came. A noble gesture. But it's too late for that. Justice from the civil world is a pale and toothless thing. A brilliant flash of lightning lit the mine entrance, followed by a deafening crash of thunder. The ground shook and dust rained down from the ceiling. The storm was directly overhead. I have spent 5 years with nothing but their ghosts for company. Silas continued, his voice rising. Do you know what that's like, Marshal? To hear your nephew's laughter in the wind. To see your sister-in-law's face in every stranger. I don't want her land back. I want my family back. His voice broke on a sob of pure anguish. I can't give you that. Kael said, his own voice thick with remorse. All I can do is bring you in. Let the law sort it out. The law. Silas laughed a raw, broken sound. The law is what you represented when you murdered them. There is no law here. There is only what is right. An eye for an eye. He stood up and Kael saw the glint of metal in his other hand. It wasn't a gun. It was a lit fuse, its spark sputtering angrily in the damp air. The fuse disappeared behind a stack of old crates. Crates of dynamite. This mine is riddled with explosives left over from the old days, Silas said, his eyes wild. Enough to bring this whole mountain down. A fitting tomb for us all. You took my world from me, Kael. Now I'm taking yours. The fuse sizzled an audible countdown to oblivion. What have you done? Alara gasped. Kael has a choice. Silas said, a manic grin spreading across his face as he finally drew his own pistol. He can kill me in act of vengeance and become the very monster he created. Or he can try to be the man of law, try to arrest me, and we all die together when the mountain comes down. What will it be, martial vengeance or justice? Kael was frozen. Kill Silas. They might have a chance to escape. Avenge Mary's locket, silence the ghosts. It was the easy way, the way of the gun. Or try to subdue him to honor the law he once served and risk being buried alive. Don't do it. Alara pleaded, her eyes fixed on him. Don't become him. Your wife, the woman you loved, she wouldn't want that. There has to be another way. Her words cut through his rage and guilt. Mary had believed in him, in the good man beneath the badge and the gun. To kill Silas in cold blood would be to kill that memory of himself forever. As the thunder roared again, shaking the very foundations of the mine, Kael made his choice. He holstered his revolver. No more killing, he said, his voice firm. Silas stared, his crazed grin faltering. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had planned for a shootout, a blaze of glory. Kael's denial of violence had disarmed him more effectively than any bullet. In that moment of hesitation, Alara acted. She wasn't looking at the men anymore. She was looking at the sputtering fuse. While they were locked in their moral battle, she had seen something else, a hidden lockbox tucked away in a crevice near the dynamite, revealed by the lantern light. It was old and rusted. Ignoring the danger, she lunged toward it, yanking at the lid. It burst open, spilling forth a cascade of yellowed papers. Land deeds and letters. Kael, she cried out, her voice filled with a shocking discovery as she scanned one of the letters. It's not what we thought. My father didn't buy the land from the county. He bought it from Silas. She held up a signed deed of sale and a letter written in a neat, elegant hand. It's from you, Silas, dated a month after the fire. You sold him the land. You wrote here that you couldn't bear to live on it, that you were leaving the territory forever. Silas stared at the paper as if it were a snake. The truth, more complex and tragic than Kael could have imagined, came crashing down. Silas hadn't been a simple victim. His grief and rage had curdled, and he had sold his legacy, cashed it in to fund his 5-year crusade of revenge, rewriting the story in his own mind, until Kael was the sole villain, and the banker was a vulture, not a buyer. He had needed a world of pure black and white to justify his own descent into darkness. The revelation broke him. The pistol fell from his nerveless fingers. The manic energy drained away, leaving a hollow, shattered man. The fuse was almost at the crate. Kael didn't hesitate. He tackled Silas, knocking him away from the blast zone, while Alara, thinking fast, grabbed a discarded miner's helmet and scooped up a puddle of muddy water, flinging it at the fuse. It hissed, sputtered, and died a mere inch from the dynamite. Silence descended, broken only by the drip of water and the distant rumble of the storm. They emerged from the mine into the clean, rain-washed air of the dying storm. The sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the wet pines in hues of gold and green. Kyle led the way with Ilara beside him. Behind them, walking with the shuffling, empty gait of a sleepwalker, was Silas Miller. All the fire of his vengeance was gone, extinguished by a truth he could no longer deny. The return to redemption was a somber affair. Kyle turned Silas over to Sheriff Brody, along with the ledger and the newly discovered letters from the lockbox. The story that unfolded was not a simple one of good versus evil, but a tangled tragedy of mistake grief and twisted obsession. Silas would face justice for the robbery and the murder, but the whole territory would now know the full complicated story of the Miller family. In the days that followed, redemption began to heal. Ilara, true to her word, started the legal process to establish a trust with her family's wealth. It would be used to right the old wrong, not by returning the land, but by funding a new school for the territory to be named in memory of Sarah and Thomas Miller. She had confronted her father not with anger, but with a quiet disappointment that was far more potent. He was a broken man, his reputation undone not by a gunslinger, but by the quiet integrity of his own daughter. Sheriff Brody offered Cale a deputy's badge. "This town could use a man like you," he said. "The man you are now, not the one you were." Cale looked at the tin star in Brody's hand. For 5 years he had been running from who he was. He had tried to bury the marshal, but the ghost had refused to stay dead. Perhaps peace wasn't found in hiding, but in service, in accepting all parts of himself. "I'll think on it," he said. But they both knew he had already made his decision. A week later, Kyle stood in the town cemetery. The air was cool and clear. He stood before a familiar weathered headstone, Mary Reed, beloved wife. In his hand, he held the silver locket. He had cleaned it, and it shone brightly in the afternoon light. With a sense of profound finality, he gently placed it on the headstone, letting it rest against the cool stone. He was not abandoning her memory, but freeing himself from the prison of his grief. Then he turned. A few yards away was a new simple marker paid for with his own money. It read, "In memory of the Miller family." He walked over to it and stood for a long moment, the silence of the cemetery, a comforting blanket. He reached out and gently touched the top of the stone, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, of apology, of atonement. He had not found the simple peace he had sought, but something more difficult and far more meaningful. A redemption earned not by the gun, but by the quiet, steady work of a healing soul. He turned his back on the graves and walked toward the town, toward the future, the deputy's badge pinned to his duster, a solid, comforting weight against his heart.